Welcome to the Beginner's Garden Podcast. And today we're going to be talking all about fall gardening with two gardeners who garden in very different climates and they have experience with other climates as well. I'm thrilled to welcome to the show Peter of the Garden Family and Rebecca from Happy Heart Gardens. They're going to share with you where they garden from. And the whole goal is to help you to be able to identify if maybe you don't garden in the same climate as I do. You've got a couple of from north to south options for you. And I think we learned a lot from each other as we see what works well in different climates. So if you're new to fall gardening, or maybe you're not new, but you're here to pick up some extra tips that you didn't know, then these next 2 weeks of episodes are going to be great for you. We have split this conversation up into two different episodes because I didn't want to rush any of this. I learned a lot and I know that you will too. So let's bring on Peter and Rebecca. Peter and Rebecca, it's so good to have you on the podcast as we talk all things fall gardening. And the one thing I'm really excited about chatting with you about is that you each garden in such different climates than I do. And I feel like that will be very beneficial for so many people who may garden in different climates than me and might be able to relate to one of you. So, Peter, let's get started with you. Just introduce yourself, where you're gardening now, your zone, and any climate in particulars that refer to how you grow to your fall and winter garden.
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks for having me on the podcast, Jill. I'm Peter. We garden under the handle at the Garden Family on both Instagram and YouTube. And it's fun to be here with you and Rebecca and talk about fall gardening today. We garden in Southwest Ohio, which is zone 6B, and recently was changed from 6A. And we do a fall garden every year, but there definitely are very specific timings that we'll get into on this podcast. But specifically, our first frost is somewhere around mid-October, and then we also deal with a very short day length starting around mid-November. That's kind of the hard stop for our fall garden.
That's really interesting because my first frost date is only a couple weeks after yours. And it sounds like when we get too low for daylight, it's just a couple weeks after. But I feel like as I've watched your fall garden, there's so many differences between when we're harvesting. So even those 2 weeks it makes a big difference. Rebecca, what about you? Where do you garden? And I know you have a couple places. So describe where you garden and a little bit about your fall garden.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's great to be here and talk gardening with you guys. So I am gardening primarily in South Alabama, zone 9A, but I also have a garden in Northern Pennsylvania, which is 5B, and I am Happy Heart Gardens on Instagram.
Okay, so we're going to have to talk more about this whole gardening in two different states thing simultaneously because I watched you do that on Instagram and I'm like, what in the world? How is this possible? But I love the knowledge that you're bringing to the table here of this zone 5, cold climate, but then also like tropical almost in
Yes.
southern Alabama. So I feel like this is really good that we've got a really good mixture here. And Peter, you're not only representing Ohio, but you also have experience in California. So can you tell us more about your experience with California gardening?
Yeah, I actually grew up in Santa Barbara, California, which is just north of Los Angeles. And so it never froze there. I think it's zone 10B. I didn't do a ton of gardening as a kid, but my parents did. And of course, we could grow, avocados and citrus and everything. That was wonderful. But there wasn't as much of an obsession about the fall garden because it never froze. And to be honest, I actually really like the fact that now that we have seasons, there is that, whether you want to or not, pause that you have to do. Whereas in Santa Barbara, it felt like, well, you just kind of keep rolling. You're growing lettuce the whole time. You're growing broccoli in the winter. And then it doesn't even really get that hot in the summer either. So you don't have that, probably Alabama will probably hear about that, the midsummer pause that you have. But we also lived in San Francisco, so different climate than Santa Barbara. Just think brassica weather year round.
Wow.
That's basically San Francisco. So our cauliflower is amazing. And don't ask us how our tomatoes were. And then we moved to Fresno, California, which is inland off the coast. And there we did have a lot more seasons. really hot in the summer,
Mm.
not humid like the South, but triple digits. Tomatoes did better in April, and then kind of paused in the middle, and then kind of resurged. And you did have a little bit of a fall garden there because it would get colder in the winter, but it rarely froze there too. So you really didn't have those specific time marks that you really have to hit well
Mm.
in a more northern climate.
That's so fascinating, and I have to laugh because when you said growing year round and you don't get hot, and Rebecca and I both our reactions we're both like, oh my gosh, because I don't know about you, Rebecca, we're under excessive heat warnings right now, and I'm sure you're about as bad as or worse probably, but so for you, Peter, or in California, it wasn't necessarily a fall garden; it was just a garden, and there's some benefits to that because you can grow year round, but I love your perspective of the seasons are actually something to be enjoyed to some degree. But depending on where you're located, you have to figure out the differences in how to actually grow in those different places. And I know we'll jump more into that, but I think that's fascinating that you have so much experience in California, and then I guess that's a reason why so much of our produce is grown in California. You answered that in like 30 seconds right there. It makes complete sense. Rebecca, though, you're growing in Alabama, and you had to clarify this for me on Instagram. Southern Alabama, like Gulf Coast, not like Northern Alabama, which is a bit much different, I'm sure, climate, and Pennsylvania. So, what are the main differences in a fall garden between Zone 9 and Zone 5?
Well, the fall garden really shines in South Alabama. And honestly, I don't do much of a fall garden in Pennsylvania just because of the timing and I'm not there as much. It would take a lot more hands on. And with me not being there full time, that's pretty much just primarily like a spring summer garden because it is so much.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's almost like with that which Peter referred to, kind of a midsummer pause when in Alabama, the summer almost acts like a winter in some degree because there's very few things you can grow, and then you just kind of flip flop sort of between the two.
Yes, definitely. Yep. Yep. I just go back and forth. So yeah, when I sort of like I'm going to be heading back in between the lulls just to harvest, the summer garden up there.
So Peter's going to Ohio. It sounds like your experience with California, you didn't have a quote unquote fall garden as much. You grew in the fall, but it wasn't a clear season of a fall garden like we would imagine when we hear the term fall garden. What have you found has been the favorite part of growing a fall garden in Ohio that maybe you didn't get to experience in California?
Yeah, I mean the fall garden. If you haven't done it, you should. It's a really welcome difference between what we're experiencing right now. So we're end of July. I just pulled out 150 pounds of paste tomatoes from our garden, and we're going to be processing those. It's just a lot going on. And then you get to the fall garden, and the summer plants are done. The pests start going away, and usually it's much smaller for us. We don't do a huge fall garden. It's maybe 3-4 by 12-foot beds, and it just kind of gives you this taste of like, oh, this is what a little backyard garden was like in comparison to the much bigger garden in the summer. It's cool, so when you're doing your tasks, you don't have to try to find that hour in the morning or right before the sun goes down. And it's really really nice just sitting out with your tea, and being out in the fall garden. So yeah, if you haven't done it, definitely should.
What about you, Rebecca? I can imagine for you, like for me, the fall garden is almost like an invitation to a new season. What's your favorite part of a fall garden in Southern Alabama?
Oh, definitely. That's like when, I can do all the greens and the lettuces and the salads come back. And like you said, it's a little bit, I mean, we're kind of always hot. So I don't really get that cool until like November-ish, where it's really comfortable to be out there again. But yeah, just seems like a little like more less maintenance for me, just because you don't have as many, fungal issues, bacterial issues. It's just more enjoyable. I agree. And I've always sort of done just a full flip from like the summer garden. I would fill all the same beds again, but I am going to cut back a little bit to have not quite such a large fall garden. At least I'm telling myself that now, but we haven't got there yet, so we'll see.
I would say that'd be the same with me. Like I have all these garden spaces that I filled in the spring, and then summer to some degree, but I think it would be hard to fill them all with fall crops because it's just not needed. All of those aren't. And so many, like you said, the greens. Now, some greens I'm sure can be frozen, but a lot of them you eat fresh. So I'm not really sure that it would, like, what would the point be of having 3 lettuce beds like you do
Right.
tomatoes? So it's less amount to have to manage. And Peter, I think you alluded to that as well. Peter, what do you focus on growing in your fall garden in Ohio? What are your favorite things to grow in the fall?
So pretty much root vegetables, brassicas, and then some leafy greens. But we like to grow what we want to eat. It's actually something that's kind of hard to do. Lots of times you want to grow a bunch of fun stuff, and then you realize you don't want to eat it. But the root vegetables. So we're just about planting, carrots and beets and things like that. And beets are nice; you can grow them the whole season here. But carrots really like that cooler weather. And then the biggest crop are just all the brassica family plants. So cabbage, broccoli, cauliflower, kale, and then we recently started growing kohlrabi, which if you have a really short fall season, that one's great because a lot of them mature in just 30 some days. So
I have never grown kohlrabi. Is that more of a northern thing?
I don't know. You should try it. You really should. It's in the brassica family, but it looks like a root vegetable, and it's above the ground. And because you eat sort of the root of it, even if you get cabbage moths on it, it doesn't really matter because they're just, chewing on the leaves up there.
Mm.
They're super quick to mature. It tastes like kind of like a tender broccoli stem, kind of a sweet broccoli stem. So you can eat them fresh, dipped in hummus or something, but you can also cook them. And like I said, I think it's Quick Star. Not sure about that one. From Johnny's Seeds, that one's like 37 days to maturity. So
Wow.
if it's September, say for us, and we have a bed and we just want to throw a few things in, that's one thing that we could probably get to maturity before it freezes.
Now, is that from seed or have you already started it from seed indoors?
I usually start all the brassicas indoors.
Okay.
They'll germinate outside, but they don't really like the heat. And so it's one of the things we're probably going to talk about is, it's really hot when you have to plant these out for us just because our season's so short. And so we start them indoors inside where it's climate controlled, and then usually about 4 weeks or so before we plant them out.
So since they're in the brassica family, do you start those seeds indoors at the same time that you do your broccoli and your cauliflower and your cabbage?
For the kohlrabi, you mean?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Yes.
for the kohlrabi, it's quicker maturing. So usually I like my brassicas to mature in the cold.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm about to plant those out in early August. If I planted my kohlrabi in early August, it's going to be mid-September when it's ready. It's usually still pretty warm in mid-September, so I usually push those out a little bit. So they're really coming in around early October. So somewhere around September 1st, late August is a better time for those. Some of them are a little bit longer maturity, but you can get, like I said, there's some that are just 30 some days, which is really nice to have a plant that has that short window to succession plant, things like that.
That's a great idea. So it's not so much that you can't plant them at the same time as the other, it's that you prefer the taste if you wait a little bit longer, which I think that's really, like you said, if people are listening to this and they're like, oh, it's too late, then maybe it's not for kohlrabi. It might be like too late for cabbage or broccoli, which probably isn't. We're still in early August, but that's a great idea. Rebecca, have you ever planted kohlrabi?
I have not, but I will definitely be getting some. And I don't think that's I don't know that that's a northern thing growing up. Well, at least in northern Pennsylvania, I don't think if you showed someone a kohlrabi, they would be like, "What?"
Okay. Well, it's hard because some people like okra. Why would I ever not have okra in my garden? And you meet someone from the north and they're like, what do you do with that?
Yes. Yeah.
So I know some crops are seasonal. Rebecca, you mentioned that you like the fall garden because you like to plant your greens. And I think you may have mentioned brassicas, but and I'm sure like you're probably planting some cool season crops too, but are you able to fit in any of your warm season crops again? Like, do you plant tomatoes again or cucumbers or squash? Do you do any of that in the fall garden?
Sometimes. So yeah, like people right now are sort of planting out their second stage of like tomatoes and stuff. I've kept a couple just going miraculously. I'm not sure how that's happened. I think shade cloths have helped because, as like you, we've been super hot, and of course things aren't happy over 90. But the shade cloth I think has really made a difference. So you can do a second round. I'm trying some zucchinis again right now. I planted about 2 weeks ago, just direct sowed. It's hit or miss with the pests, so I don't go too heavy. It's more or less just an experiment. But then what I'll do is I'll sort of do a early fall, late summer crop of like cover crops like black eyed peas. And then I'll come in with like my greens and my brassicas more in like October-ish, November-ish.
Okay. Okay. So do you do any root crops like Peter was talking
Oh,
about in the
yeah,
fall,
and
or do you keep those?
carrots. Yeah, absolutely. Carrots. I'll even do another round of potatoes like mid-September, because I'll usually do them in grow bags. If we would get we don't usually get frost till 1st of December, so I could pull them in if necessary, which is nice with the grow bags.
Now I have a question about this because I think that it was your Instagram feed. Do you grow chickpeas?
Yes. Hmm.
Okay, so I think I've been stalking you because I saw that you were growing chickpeas in the spring because they're cool season crops, right?
Right. Yeah.
And I'm obsessed with them right now. I've got them on my salads every single day, and I'm like, I need to figure out how to grow these. But from what I saw you talk about on Instagram, they're kind of picky as far as needing cool season. So do you grow those ever in the fall, or do you wait to do those in the spring?
I'm trying to think when I planted them out before. More springtime, so probably like January. I planted January, February. They also don't like they like really junk soil. They don't like it too
Oh.
wet. So if you just have sort of like a dry spot where you want to just like throw some seeds, yeah. And I've even grown them from grocery store dried chickpeas.
Okay. But
Believe it or
can
not.
they take a freeze?
I would say no.
Okay.
I don't
Okay.
think they
So
can.
they're the kind that's kind of finicky with climates like ours where we don't get much of the cool season. But if you're starting in January, are you done with freezes by January?
Well, the time to get like kind of going, maybe it was February. I'm so bad with like writing down dates. But yeah, I would say, you probably want to start them, yeah, after your like frost date. But yeah, I think I'm done like 1st of February is about mine, mid-February.
Okay.
So it's probably end of January.
Yeah. Yeah, goals. I decided not to add it to my spring crop this year, so I wasn't sure if it would be a fall candidate, but you don't have any experience with that, so maybe I should wait for spring.
Yeah, I would do spring. I know in the north, some people grow them and like, they're growing them now, but of course that's in like
Okay.
Pennsylvania. Hmm.
Do you grow those, Peter?
No, we do eat quite a lot of chickpeas though.
So now
So
you're curious too.
yeah, maybe maybe we need to. I mean, we eat them in salads. I mean, there's a joke at work. I eat hummus every day.
Mm.
So hmm, maybe we need to try them. I didn't know they were a cool season crop. I would have thought they'd be similar to other beans, but I guess they like the cooler weather.
And again, probably in your area, they would be more of a summer crop, but for me, it's like a cooler crop. I know, what is it? Homegrown and hand gathered, I think. They're growing them right now. They actually just harvested theirs and they're around the Pittsburgh area, which is probably kind of similar to
Okay.
your zone.
Yeah, similar.
Yeah.
Yeah, you don't really hear anybody talking about growing them. So it's one of those things. It took a while. You never heard about peanuts, and now you hear more about peanuts. Maybe
Yeah.
chickpeas will gain some steam.
Yeah.
So maybe people will hear this and start practicing and sharing, and we can all learn from each other because I would love to grow those.
Oh, please do. They're a beautiful little plant too. Just real quick, they're fairly short. They have beautiful foliage and little white flowers.
Oh, yeah, I liked seeing what you grew before. As far as timing goes, I know, Rebecca, you said you didn't really write a whole lot down, but in your mind, typically, when do you start planting, let's say your cool season crops, not your like second summer crops, but when do you start doing that? And then also, you said you start getting frost in December, right?
Mm-hmm. Can be like early December. The weather has been, I don't know, probably like the same for you guys, very all over the place. I feel like the normal dates are sort of changing. Like it would be more like mid late December. Now it seems to be sort of pushing itself earlier. So yeah, so I plant them out October. But even when I get a frost, it's usually like what I like to call just a kiss of a frost. So we're like right
Hmm.
on the edge of a frost. And we did get 25 a couple days. for like a couple hours. But I also am a big believer of like frost cloth and all that kind of stuff.
So are you planting most of your cool season crops in October then?
Yeah, so I'll do that mostly in
Perfect.
October. And I'll succession
Okay.
plant the carrots all the way through like March.
Oh, okay. That's a good idea. I hadn't thought of that. Peter, when do you start planting your cool season crops? I figure you have some already in the grow room right now.
Yeah, so we started them early July. So I'm just potting them up right now, and then in the next 2 weeks we'll get the brassicas in. And biggest challenge there is it's going to be probably 90 degrees outside.
Mhm.
So we have to get them in by that time because they need to mature really by the end of October for us. So the shorter your season, the more your timing is going to be super important, which I think is why it's great that you have all of us here on the podcast, because don't take fall garden planning as a generality. You have
Mm.
to look very specifically at people where you are. Really, ideally, have somebody just in your neighborhood or something that's a good gardener that knows, because even just going north or south 100 miles can make a difference in getting that timing right.
How did you learn that timing, Peter, coming from California, where it sounds like you had a lot of flexibility with the fall garden because you didn't have those hard dates necessarily that you have now. So how did you learn that?
Well, I lost a lot of crops. So we're not really
Best way
lost
to
a
learn.
yeah, part of it was, most of the time you'll start them too late. If you're
Mhm.
in a northern area, you're gonna start them too late because it's crazy right now. The summer garden is in full swing. The last thing you're gonna be thinking is, "I better start some broccoli inside," right? I mean, you're harvesting everything, you're processing everything. So before, you'd think, "Oh, it's September. It's starting to feel like fall. Let's get the fall garden going." Well, it's too late at that point for here. So I had definitely had seasons where you'd have broccoli plants, but you never get any broccoli because it didn't have enough time to mature. So and even last season, I keep kind of a diary. Part of the reason I do the video diary is sort of selfish. It's for me.
Mm.
Um, and some of those plants matured and some didn't. And I really felt like I could have been maybe a week or two earlier. And of course, it's seasonal. As you guys are probably experiencing too, we're getting these really big temperature swings. And it seems like what happens for us is we get really cold the end of October, like too cold to keep your plants alive. And then it just gets mild again, but by that time all your plants are dead. So I think we're going to
Yeah.
talk a little bit about row covers and things like that at some point, because that's, I think, becoming more important with climate change that we're seeing.
I agree. We'll be talking about that in next week's episode for sure. We're going to dive more into that. But before we get there, I want to talk a little bit more about timing because I think that's probably, I would say, the most critical thing for beginners to learn. And you echoed that, Peter, as well. Rebecca, are you a planner as such? Where do you have a general fall planting schedule that you try to follow, or what does that look like for you?
Probably a little more willy nilly. But I have learned, I mean, the best way really, I think, as a beginner is just like find out when that sort of general last, frost date is, or first frost date, excuse me, and then just sort of back it up from what you want to grow. I mean, that's kind of the easiest way, I think, for a beginner to look at the fall garden. And that's, kind of what I do too, with like broccoli and stuff like that. And also know that, some of those things will take a little bit of frost. If you're in a milder area, they can take like 30. Some things can take to 28. So, don't be afraid to maybe experiment, go, if it's your first fall garden, maybe go a little small just to see, get the dates down, get your timing down, and then go from there. So I try to make notes, but I am just horrible at it. So I tell myself I'm going to remember it all, but it kind of works out.
So do you have a routine that you think, okay, I normally plant, you mentioned carrots. You mentioned succession planting carrots. Do you have where you start at a certain time and then like every couple of weeks you throw some more seeds in? Like what does that look like for you?
Yeah, it just depends on the space and how much I have left. I mean, if I still have a ton in the freezer and I'm just doing it for our own fresh eating, then I'm not going to do as much. But yeah, usually every few weeks I'll kind of, and I also even though they don't recommend it. When I thin, I'll sometimes kind of take the little thinning, and put them around as sort of a succession plant. Um, so yeah, it just kind of really depends what I have going on. As far as sometimes I do starts inside. This year I'm not, since I'm going to Pennsylvania to that garden for longer. So I'll just buy starts when I get back, support some of the local schools. We're really fortunate that we have some great horticultural programs at the local schools, and they self starts. So
Oh, wow.
yeah.
I wonder if that's something that's more unique to Southern, because when I was first a beginning gardener, I don't remember seeing any fall starts. Now they're at more of our feed stores and even nurseries, maybe in Lowe's. But I have also heard from people that they haven't seen anybody with fall starts. Peter, do you see that nurseries are carrying fall starts in Ohio in general?
They aren't. That's kind of one of the big challenges is if you're not starting your own seeds. th- I think there's just not quite enough demand. Maybe the collective gardening community starts needs to start telling everyone that they really want, fall veggies. But for the most part, there's discount tomatoes
Mm,
in July. There's not broccoli.
yeah,
So that's definitely a challenge. You have to start your seeds indoors, but if you haven't done that, might be a good excuse to do it. It's a smaller amount of seeds, and it's pretty fun.
true. Yes, for sure. That's interesting that you don't see that there. And so I guess that is very regional. And maybe it depends on too how close you are to an urban center, and maybe rural is a little bit more difficult. I don't know. Or maybe rural you have more because more people garden. I don't know. But all that to say is if you're a new gardener, don't just assume that you can find them. Maybe ask around and see if people locally will sell them. And otherwise, there's so many crops that you can direct sow, like carrots and beets and lettuce and greens. And then maybe next year, just know that you could start those seeds indoors ahead of time. Peter, what does your fall planting schedule or routine look like? Or do you have I mean, I'm very regimented, so I have all my dates and I know when I'm doing all that. Are you like that? Or are you more like Rebecca, where you just kind of take a lay of your space and what you need, and you just kind of plant as you need to go?
I mean, I'd like to be more laid back about it, but I do think timing is the most important thing in our area, just because it's so truncated
Mm,
how long you have. So absolutely. So early July is when you have to start all your brassicas indoors. We tend to mature our plants indoors pretty quickly. We have high powered LED grow lights, and I've noticed that they just tend to mature. So really,
mm,
I only need a good month before they're pretty big plants to plant out. So if you're doing a windowsill or something like that, you might even have to do end of June,
mm.
as far as starting those, because the goal is to get a nice healthy seedling in the ground by early August. And this is something that I learned kind of the hard way with fall gardening, is because the days are much shorter. Even though the days are warm, the days are a lot shorter than the spring garden. And so the days to maturity on your plants are based on a spring planting. And so you got to add about 10 to 14 days or so, as far as your timing goes with those, because as we get towards harvesting end of October, I mean, we're talking about 10 and a half hour days. These are short days, and it's just going to take longer for the plants to mature. So early August, they have to be in the ground, because a lot of the brassicas are somewhere around 70-ish days to maturity, and we really need those to be harvested by the end of October, realistically. And if you have enough protection, as long as it makes a head, you can kind of keep them in the ground, but they're not really going to mature much, once we head into November.
I feel the same way because I've learned the hard way of planting things too late and then they're not maturing. And sometimes I'd be lucky and they'd overwinter, but I'm guessing that's probably not a luxury you would have in Ohio. So you either get them mature or they don't. And so that makes that plant timing a little bit more critical. Whereas with Rebecca, in climates like yours, there's a little bit more give and take where you're not such in a rush to do it all. And Peter hit on something that I really want us to dive into in next week's episode, which is daylight, because I think that's an area that just really shocked me at how much of an impact it had on my garden. And so we're going to talk about that more in next week's episode, along with how to handle frost and freezes and how to cover. We're going to dive into that because I think we've all been starting to use that. Even Rebecca, I know you already mentioned it, but it's going to differ based on your climate how we use those covers. So we'll talk about all of that in next week's podcast. I'm excited to have you guys join me back next week. I hope you enjoyed that conversation as much as I did, and be sure that you're subscribed to the podcast because we will be continuing this conversation next Tuesday with Peter and Rebecca, where we will be diving into more things fall gardening, especially daylight and covering, how we can keep our plants covered through the winter if we choose. That's something that Peter will talk about too. You may not choose to, and we'll talk about why. Can't wait to see you again on next week's episode, and I'll chat with you then.